believe that this tradition dates back to the beginning of Revelation at Sinai, that it was received at Sinai. It's very interesting because the first text that clearly speaks of reincarnation, Jewish text, it's pre-Zohar. The Zohar, pre-Zohar. The Zohar is published in 1390. 100 years before the publication of the Zohar was the first Kabbalistic text to ever be published. It was the year 1290. There was a book called Sefer HaBayir, the Book of Illumination, or the Book of Brilliance, Sefer HaBayir. We don't know who the author is. The tradition is that it's a much older author. But it was that was the first published book on Kabbalah, on Jewish spirituality. And the understanding was that it was a tradition that goes back many years before. Some attribute this text to a first century rabbi called Mechunya ben Akana, who's a very mystical character that appears in the Talmudic times. In Sefer HaBayir, that's the first time it explicitly mentions the concept of reincarnation. So imagine you live in the 1300s, and just 20 years prior, a book comes out that says that it's part of Kabbalah, part of tradition. And the tradition is that there's the concept of reincarnation, and souls transmigrate, they reincarnate. We actually didn't speak about transmigration at all. Transmigration is when souls actually reincarnate into other forms of life, not into human beings, which is another concept. But Sefer HaBayir speaks about the possibility of reincarnation and transmigration, of souls recycling, so to speak. Some of the 1300 philosophers at that time, Jewish philosophers, the definition of philosophy is lover of knowledge, which means philosophy is based on rational thinking. Some of the philosophers said this is not a Jewish tradition. You speak about reincarnation, it's not actually really a Jewish idea. Some of them, even earlier, like Saadia Gaon, I don't know if you're familiar with Saadia Gaon, lived in the 10th century, 11th century. He says that there are those amongst us who speak about this concept of reincarnation, but it's not really a Jewish idea. It's an influence of the Greeks, of Maimonides is a whole other conversation, because Maimonides doesn't speak about anything of the afterlife. That's another conversation. Correct, but not afterlife. Because Maimonides as a whole, he has a letter why he speaks in his letter why he doesn't talk about these topics. But Maimonides is not proof, because Maimonides is interested in law and in the here and now. This is what Maimonides is interested in. But there were other great philosophers that said that if it's a rational reason why we believe in reincarnation, we don't believe. The Kabbalist response was, no, this is not just because it makes sense. This is actually our tradition. So the rationalists argued and says, where does this tradition come from? And they said, this is what we received in our tradition. So those who were privy to this tradition, this Kabbalistic tradition, knew about this tradition of reincarnation. What's very interesting is that in the book of Josephus, which is the only parallel text that we have from the Second Temple period, or post-Temple Second period, that is not the Mishnah, the Judaic law, and the Talmud. So it's a contemporary text to the Talmud, but it's written by someone that's standing on the outside, not someone standing on the inside. So he has no real, exactly, there's no real reason for him to say something that's not true. Now, Josephus writes that there are those amongst us, there are different groups of Jews, if you're familiar a little with the Second Temple period, there were the Essenes, there were the Sadducees, there were the Pharisees, there were different groups of Jews. They're all part of the same tribal group, but there were different groups. And he says that there are certain groups of Jews which are the more mystical Jews that believe in reincarnation, speak about reincarnation as the tradition of reincarnation, and they speak about it as something that's part of their tradition, part of their mystical tradition. So we see that thousands of years ago, prior, or at least at the same period of time as Pythagoras and Plato and some of the great Greek philosophers who do speak about reincarnation, there is a parallel to that in Jewish texts, which is that there are Jewish writings that speak about reincarnation. That's what we know that the tradition is actually an authentic tradition. So the word Kabbalah means received tradition. That's what it actually means. It doesn't mean anything mystical. It means received tradition. So the Kabbalistic tradition is that this goes back to Sinai. This is the original teachings, and part of the original teachings were that it was received, the tradition of how reincarnation works. Over periods of time, let's say, talking about the Zohar is published in 1290. The Zohar appears in the Jewish scene almost out of the blue. No one ever heard of the Zohar until it was published. When the Zohar was published in 1290 by Moshe de Leon, who's an Italian Kabbalist, he attributes these texts to the 2nd century mystic called Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi. There's a big controversy whether these texts are actually his or not. But the tradition is that these are actually authentic texts, with minor, perhaps slight additions and editing that occurred throughout history. But these are the authentic texts. In the Sefer HaZohar, the book of the Zohar, which again is published in 1290, the Zohar itself cryptically speaks about reincarnation. There's only one place in the Zohar where it explicitly speaks about reincarnation, which is interesting. It's in the Zohar of the portion of Mishpatim, and I'll explain to you why. And this is the only place, it's called Razeh de Mishpatim, the secret of judgments. And in the secret of judgment, it talks about reincarnation. Now, in the Torah law, there's ritual law, which is called chukim, and there's mishpatim, which is rational law. Not to steal is a mishpat, that's a rational law. To keep kosher is a chok, is a ritual law. There's one portion of the Torah that's called mishpatim, which is the civil law, civil rational law. Civil law, you harm someone's cow, how much do you have to pay? Or in contemporary language, you have an accident and you damage someone's car, or what do you do?
Isn't that odd? It would mean that.
No, this is part of civil law. This is the laws of the civil society. That's correct.
It's very weird.
That's correct. So this is a very interesting observation. So the only place where the Zohar chooses to talk about reincarnation is when it talks about civil law. Why? This is very interesting. Because it appears from a deeper reading of text that we spoke about reincarnation this afternoon, where souls reincarnate, and generally the souls that reincarnate for new purposes, for a new tikkun. Past life was perfect, the soul reaches perfection, now goes on to another body, and now it's reaching its perfection. And every subsequent life, the soul is reaching another perfection. Okay, so that's what you're thinking is mostly incorrect.
Today, only the part that needs
to correct it. Okay, so let's think about this concept a second. There is an unusual form of reincarnation, which is when the entire consciousness of the person. See, most forms of reincarnation, the consciousness of self, which is the memory, the personality of self, doesn't actually reincarnate into the next form. It's only the parts of self that weren't articulated, that weren't expressed, that now have to come back into another form of life. So it can express itself. There's a situation where the actual consciousness of the person returns to this world with memory, perhaps, and that is in two scenarios. Either this could be into another form of life, which we have to talk about, not into another human being, or if there was some type of violation that is monetary. Let's say somebody steals money from somebody, God forbid, takes money from somebody. For everything in the world, spiritual cleansing works. Like we said, the editing. The only thing that doesn't work is if you actually take $1 out of someone's pocket. How do you repay that? You can bang your chest and say, please forgive me 1,000 times, but that person lost $1. So here's a very interesting situation where a person has to come down to a body. It already achieves its tikkun, and the only reason why it comes back into another form of life, again, to another cycle, is to return that $1. Let me give you a little short story about this. The Baal Shem Tov, the great mystical master, had a student called Dov Ber. You know what I picked up. His student, Dov Ber, was called the Maggid of Mezrich. And the Maggid, when he was a younger man, was studying the Zohar, the portion of Mishpatim. And he came across this passage of the Zohar that talks about reincarnation. So he goes over to his teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, and says, "Can you explain me what this means?" The Baal Shem Tov says, "I will not explain you verbally, but I'll show you what it means. Today, or let's say tomorrow, I want you to journey out of town, into the outskirts of town, and sit by a particular tree and just observe what you see. Don't do anything, don't mix in, just observe." Okay. Next morning he wakes up, and he goes to the outskirts of the city, and he's sitting in this field, and he sits down under a tree, and he's observing. And he's sitting there for a few moments. A person walks by, apparently a wealthy person, dressed well, and he has a big stash of coins and gold, and he lies down to sleep. And he's watching this person sleep. He takes his nap. It's an hour later. The person gets up and walks away. And he realizes that the stash of money and coins and gold is left in the place where he was resting. But he's told not to say anything, just to observe. So he is observing, he watches. The guy leaves. That's person number one. Person number two walks by, goes to sleep, lies down, wakes up, looks around and sees a big stash of gold, coins. He turns around, he screams, "Is anyone here? Anyone lose this money?" There's no one there. The student Dov Ber is sitting on the side and watching. He looks in the bag to see if there's any indication who owns it. It's just generic Chanel. He can't tell. So what does he do? He picks up the bag and walks away. Person number three walks by. Sees the same place to rest. It's a very nice place to rest. Lies down, takes a nap. Meanwhile, person number one is, let's say, 10 miles into his journey, touches himself, realizes, wait a second, I'm missing my bag. Goes back to the tree to find his bag. He sees the guy sleeping there. He wakes the guy up, says, "Where's my bag of gold?" He says, "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm lying here, there's no bag of gold." He says, "You're a thief, you're hiding the bag of gold. You probably dug it into the ground, you put it aside. Give me my bag of gold." "I don't have your bag of gold." They start fighting with each other, and person number one beats person number three. At this point, the Maggid is completely puzzled. Nightfall comes and he realizes the story is over and it's time for him to go back to his teacher. So he goes back to the Baal Shem Tov and tells the Baal Shem Tov, "Okay, I saw a very interesting story, but what does it mean?" The Baal Shem Tov said like this: person number one and person number two were in an argument in their past life. Person number one and person number two, they did business together. It turns out that person number one was a clever man, and he cheated his partner for a lot of money. That's person number two. So when they came up after 120, they said that part of their soul process of tikkun would be to go back down. Person number one will become a wealthy man, will have a lot of money. Person number two will receive all the money that he needs from person number one. That's what you had. He lost his money, and he picked up the money that belonged to him. So the Maggid said, "And who's person number three that got beat up?" He said, "That was the judge that they went in front of, who was corrupted and ruled like person number one instead of person number two." So they all had to reincarnate to perfect something on a civil level. This is the laws of Mishpatim. On a spiritual level, again, spiritual damage can be undone on a spiritual level. Emotional alert, it's all could be forgiven. The one thing that can be forgiven, if you did forgive. Of course, if you do tshuva, everything is repaired. But if you don't, this is something that a person may have to reincarnate. There's another extreme example of this, which is the opposite, which is when a person will reincarnate into another form of life. When a human being reincarnates into another form of life, the totality of that human being actually reincarnates, which means the full memory of that person is entrapped in this particular consciousness. It could be an animal, it could be a stone, it could be a leaf. Everything in this world has a soul. Everything. The most simple definition of soul is movement. The quality of movement. Definition of physicality is the absence of movement. The definition of spirituality is animating the inanimate, animating the non-movement. Take it, for example, a human being has movement, expands, grows, through different stages of life, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, but constantly growing back and forth. And then an animal has life, and expanding and moving. A tree has movement, and a stone has movement. The difference between a stone and a human being is observation. We see more movement in a human being than a stone. But if you look under a microscope and you look at a stone, you'll see that a stone is also created with a lot of movement. The molecules, everything is moving around. And most of it is empty space. So because we call something inanimate is because we don't observe its movement. Something that's more complex, which means a higher form of life, has more movement. A vegetable, for example, or a tree, moves in its place of growth. Wherever it's rooted in the ground, that's where it grows. An animal has a higher evolved consciousness, which is not only does it expand vertically and horizontally in its place of its growth, but it can actually physically move out of its location. The human being has the highest form of movement because not only can we physically move out of our place, but we can also understand other people. We can actually enter into another person. I mean this on a psychological level. If we can sympathize with somebody and empathize with another person, we can enter into their shoes and feel how they're feeling or how they're understanding. That means that there's movement, a psychological movement, that I am moving into your space and you're moving into my space. That's why in Hebrew, the definition of the human being, it's very interesting that how do you define the human being? There's so many ways that psychologists, philosophers throughout the ages have defined what is the definition of a human. Human is a rational being, a social being. What is the definition of the human being? And according to classic Jewish philosophy, the definition, a speaking being. Because communication means that I can understand you, you can understand me. I can enter into your place. Animals have feeling. And animals, you can see, have sympathy for each other. If you see sometimes even an elephant mourns, you can see this physically, the expression of animals' emotions. But they don't have communication skills, so far, at least the way we know it. And the concept of communication is that we enter into another person's space. If you can explain me how you're feeling, really, what's going on in your life, then I can enter into your place and I can explain you how I am feeling. And that's the beginning of civilization. The beginning of human civilization is the beginning of speech. When speech occurs, that's when civilization occurs. Correct. Well, if you just have thinking without speech, it wouldn't create a civilization because every person would think independently. The only way we create a civilization is when one person thinks and another person helps them think. One person's thinking, one person's an engineer, one person's a builder, so they're able to think with each other how to build a building. This is the way creativity occurs, through communication. So it's possible for a human being to be entrapped in another form of life. And the intention of the human being being entrapped in another form of life is for this soul to achieve tikkun, also to achieve its purpose of elevation. So for example, this is a classic example, it's brought down in the Ari's writings. It says that an arrogant person needs to reincarnate as a bee. Not as a queen bee, but as one of the worker bees. Because the life of a worker bee, I don't know if you ever saw a bee. What's it called? A bee. No. There's a film called A Bee. Yeah. It's called Bee or something. I don't know. Something like that. The Bee movie. It's about a bee. This is basically the life of the bee. The life of the bee is that you work for the hive. You work for the queen. If you're an arrogant person, and your whole existence is arrogance, the only way that you can unlearn arrogance is if your whole lifespan is serving others. Now, if you're going to be created as a human being, it's not going to work that way because it's going to be part of it serving yourself. So you have to enter into a consciousness of an animal that only serves the queen. Now, it's only for a certain period of time. You don't actually become the soul of the bee. The bee doesn't have a human consciousness, and the bee doesn't have memory. The bee doesn't have dialogue, doesn't speak. But together with the bee soul, there's a soul in the bee. It's independent. Together with that soul, there's also a soul of a human being that's present there that goes through the process of learning how to serve the queen bee. You know, in Yiddish, how do you say, you know how they say bee in Yiddish? Anyone speak Yiddish? German? All right. German, how do you say in German? Yiddish? Bin. A bee. A bina. Right. So in Yiddish it's called a bin. Okay? Now a bee is a bin. In Yiddish, the phrase is like this. What does an arrogant person walk around saying? An arrogant person walks around saying is, I am, right, that's the beginning of their statement. I am smart. I am, I'm this, I am that, I am this. Now in Yiddish, if you speak Yiddish, the way you would say it is, Ich is I, bin am. Ich bin klug, I am smart. Ich bin stark, I'm strong. Now you take the word ich bin, it means I am, but it can also mean I be. So the Pinchas Karatzer once said that that's why you reincarnate into a bee, because you become what you constantly say you are. So if you walk around saying, I'm a bee, I'm a bee, I'm a bee, yeah, they're becoming a bee. But that's obviously a light interpretation of something that's a spiritual understanding of unlearning processes. And this is also to do with all forms of life. For example, I don't want to scare you, but eating meat is a very, very serious thing, according to spiritual Judaism. Because eating meat is possibly eating souls of human beings that are in the meat. Besides that, the souls of animals, it's possible that they actually have souls of human beings. Now, this sounds really... Yeah, maybe that's why... We're not talking about it doesn't become the soul of the animal. The animal has its individual soul, but within this... Let me explain something very simply. This is very important to understand. Everything in creation, besides the human being, is perfect. You know that? Everything besides the human being is perfect. Absolutely not. You know why? Because everything is doing exactly what they were created to do. It's instinct. A lion that hunts is not being a bad lion. It's not being a good lion when it doesn't hunt. It's being itself. A lion doesn't have choice. A lion doesn't say, you know what, today I'm not going to hunt, today I'm going to take a vacation, and smoke cigars. A lion hunts for a living. That's the way it lives. So everything in creation, a tree, an animal, a plant, a stone, everything is perfect. So nothing needs tikkun. The only thing that needs tikkun is the human being. So in the human being consciousness, which needs tikkun, we need some type of perfection, some type of elevation, enters into another consciousness, be it a stone or an animal, for a certain period of time, let's say a month, 2 months, whatever the period of time is, when it exists there, it's doing exactly what it should be doing, and that's part of its tikkun. So either it goes through that process, either it lives for the certain periods of time, and there's certain months and certain different time zones and time periods, how long souls reincarnate in different elements of creation. Either it does that, or if this animal was slaughtered correctly and then became meat that you're going to eat, and the soul still need to be there, let's say, for a month, and on this 15th day it was slaughtered, the soul still exists within the meat. Now there's something very interesting occurring, because now the animal is no longer alive. But this soul is not yet perfect. It was meant to be in this animal for 30 days. That's the way it reaches perfection. Now it becomes your responsibility to eat that food with proper intention, with a blessing, with a proper intention, and that's the way you'll elevate the soul that exists within this food. If you don't do that, what you're really doing is you're bringing negative energy into yourself. Did you ever have a meal, not because you overate, just a regular meal, and you feel really sick, not because you're food poisoned, but something doesn't feel right, spiritually something feels constricted, you don't feel expansive, something is wrong. This is possible, yeah, it's possible because you have high cholesterol or whatever, but it's also possible that this has to do with a spiritual truth, which is that you are what you eat, and you just brought into yourself a consciousness that hasn't yet been elevated, and is still waiting for its elevation. So if you do this properly, then you elevate the consciousness and you've done a big mitzvah, you've actually done a great kindness. But if you haven't, the reverse occurs and you're actually taking in negative energy. All foods. Everything. Goes with all foods. But specifically when it becomes more dense, which means not a vegetable but an animal, and not a chicken but a meat, it becomes more serious souls. Many more serious tikkunim are entered into into that form of life. So therefore, in the Talmud, it's not even in the Zohar. The Talmud says a person should eat meat. Only a person that's a scholar and someone that's really understands what they're doing and someone that's really gets it, or to at least when you eat meat, do it seriously. Now fish is an interesting animal because fish, it says it's the souls of the righteous. Talk about souls at tzaddikim. We talked about before that there are souls that are perfect, relatively perfect. They wrote a good story, and everything is written as almost perfect. But there's a slight little damage that maybe they didn't perfect. What happens to this soul? It's possible this soul will have to come down to a very short process of reincarnation into another form of life, and it will go through all the stages of death as well through the animal. And that's the way it reaches its tikkun. So the souls of very righteous people, it says, reincarnate into fish. That's why there's also a tradition that very righteous people like fish. Big tzaddikim like fish. And fish is a very important food. Because fish, halachically, does not need to go through the same process of slaughter like an animal. And the reason for that is because fish represents a being that's a more higher form of life. And because of that, only very special souls reincarnate into fish. So it's also fish, but it's also with any animal. Again, but if you eat something and you have zero intention, there was one story, I mean this is a little bit off, but the Kotzker Rebbe once saw one of his students eating fish. He's very involved, he's eating fish. And he has his 2 forks in the fish. And the Kotzker says, "What are you doing?" He says, "I love fish." So the Kotzker says, No. You love yourself. If you love the fish, you wouldn't be eating it. So the point is, when you do eat it, I'm not saying you shouldn't eat fish, I'm not saying you shouldn't, everything has life. Just acknowledge that. If you're eating a vegetable, it also has life. The moment you cut off a vegetable, the moment you take a fruit, the moment you take a piece of salad, you cut it off from its root, you're taking life. The question is, when you eat something, are you doing it with a higher consciousness? Are you saying a blessing? You're doing it with kavanah, with intention? Then you're elevating things. And then there's an intention. Or you're just eating because you have nothing else to do. And that's not a good thing. So we always have to be just conscious about how we eat, and when we eat it. That the Torah itself says that there's a nefesh, even for other forms of life. When it talks about animals in the beginning of Genesis, it says that there's a nefesh chaya. Yes, so nefesh, and the way Maimonides describes this, the level of nefesh, which we'll call bioenergy, like the basic level of physicality. If you ever look at a tree bends to light to get nourishment. That's part of its nefesh. Everything has a nefesh. When we're talking about a self-reflective soul, which means a soul that becoming aware of itself, that we think only a human being can have. That's different. That's a consciousness that is aware of its own consciousness. But everything else in creation has a soul. It's just different levels of soul. The vegetable has one level of soul, the animal has another level of soul. But everything has, and the whole existence is really just physicalities and stuff. I'm sorry?
The nefesh is supposed to be in the
That's
blood.
correct. Yeah, damu nefesh. The Torah says you can't eat the blood because the soul is in the nefesh. First of all, you have to phrase your question differently. You have to say that then Hinduism is very similar to this. No, so that's the problem. We have to first. We're not really interested. I mean, I'm not. You could be interested, but in Hinduism per se, I'm familiar with a lot of Hindu teachings. I know what they say, but there's a very big, major distinction between the way we're talking about reincarnation and the way it was understood in the East. This is the basic difference. According to the East, and I don't know where we're getting into this conversation, but we'll just make it clear. According to the East, there is no afterlife. There is no Gan Eden, Gehenna, there is no process of an afterlife. That's correct. See, this is the problem. According to the way the Torah understands, the Torah describes reincarnation, we believe in two simultaneous truths that seem to be contradictory to each other. And this is a famous question that was posed to Shlomo ben Aderes in the 1300s. On one hand, we say reincarnation, which means the soul reincarnates. Spirit. That the soul reincarnates. Okay, that makes sense on one level. On the other hand, we say that every single soul goes back into paradise. So where's the soul? Is it reincarnating or going back into paradise? So if you don't believe in a paradise, this works very well. This is one reincarnation after the next, and this passing over to both. But the way we discuss reincarnation today, and this is the way the Kabbalists understood reincarnation, they're simultaneously two truths, because the soul actually divides itself. And that's a very important distinction, because what that means also, there's an image of a slot in a window. This is a very famous Eastern image. There's a small slot in the window. And I just want to, before, not to get into that rabbi or whatever he taught, but a lot of Jews that talk about reincarnation are really just puppeting Hindu ideas. They're not really understanding of this very, very big distinction. That when you look at a slot, let's say there's a little hole in the window, and you never saw an elephant in your life. This is the metaphor. And you see an elephant. So first you see the trunk of the elephant. Then you see the nose of the elephant. Then you see the body of the elephant. Then you see the tail of the elephant. And you see them in three separate times. Right? You're looking once, you look back, you see another part, you look back, you see another part. When you look at that, you actually think they're three separate animals. Right? One's a nose. An animal looks like a nose. One's an animal looks like a body. One's an animal looks like a tail. Correct? The only way you actually realize that they're one animal is if you open the door and you see the whole elephant standing in front of you. So some of the mystics in the East would say that really consciousness is one. There's only one consciousness from the beginning of time to the end of time. What we're just observing is the slot through the window. This consciousness is one time, this consciousness is another time, this consciousness another time. If you widen the doors of perception, if you ever read the book, Doors of Perception, Huxley, if you widen the doors of perception, you open up your vision, you see one big elephant standing in front of you. This is actually not a Jewish idea. You know why? Because one of the fundamental understandings of Judaism is that every single person is responsible for their own lives. That there was never a you in the past, and there will never be you in the future. There was never a moment of that past, and there was never a moment of the future. The most important moment in the entire history of civilization, of creation, you know when? Right now. And you know who's the most important person that have ever lived? You. Because there was never a you, and there never will be a you. There's never this moment, never will be this moment. And you are responsible for your life fully, right now. Every individual person is completely responsible for their own life. Having said that, we can understand why we talk about eternity. And like we spoke about today, we're not talking about eternity only in the afterlife, but eternity in the present life and in the future. Because the more refined we are, the more transparent our ego becomes, the more we live in eternal in the present, and the more eternity we become in the future. For now and forever. Us. Having said that, we also understand and have a tradition of reincarnation, which seems to contradict, because reincarnation means that it's actually one soul. And the answer is that it's one and it's two. On a conscious level, every single person is separate. I'm separate from you, this time is separate from the other. On an uber super conscious level, if there's such a word, there's all one. So when we talk about individual people, yes, we're talking about individual people. And every individual person, your life is your life. And you're not living the effects of a past life, and your actions will not affect the future life, for the most part. For the most part, you are the orchestrator of your existence. You're given the tools to perfect your life as much as possible. There's certain specific tikkun that you have in this world that is very specific to you. You have to work on them. These are traits that you have to work on. The reason why you have to work on these traits, not on other traits, is because someone in the past life worked on the other traits. So that's the continuation. But your life, you have to work on these specific issues. When 120 passes and you have to move on to the next form of life, your entire self will move on to a place that we call Gan Eden, paradise. Individual memory will become part of the collective memory, and parts of your deeper superconscious self that were never manifest in this world will come down and reincarnate into another body. So there is a connection. Your first part of the question is memory in the body. Let's talk about the first two parts. Memory in the body, that's correct. In fact, I would say that within the next few years, we're probably going to understand that memory is not only distributed in the heart or the brain, I think memory is distributed throughout the entire body. I think if you, at the top of your fingernail actually contains memory of your childhood. And maybe there's a reason why you're twitching a certain way has to do with the reaction of trauma. And I think the body, everything is the body is, the way we're moving towards scientifically is the spiritual way we're going to move in that direction is to oneness, is to unity. That's that's Mashiach, right? We're going to move to that place where we're going to have the holy grail of science is the unified theory of everything. The unified theory of everything, which is quantum mechanics and relativity in one, is really the movement into the understanding that there's only one. And this is the image of the Zohar where the lower and the higher and lower wisdoms merge. The higher and lower wisdoms merge means the science and the spirituality come together as one. There's been some people that have written some books about this, especially in the 60s, like the Tao of Physics, and other people have written like Dancing Masters, whatever. Some people have written about this topic, about how physics is moving in the direction to understanding of the spiritual. Which what I suggest is what it's really saying is that eventually we're going to understand that there is only one. There's only one. That one we call God, and that's the container that contains everything. And of course, God is also transcendent. But God in the immanence is the God of one. And we're going to move to that direction where we start recognizing the one. Before we divided the body into separation, the brain has this memory, that has that memory. Now we say it's a holographic image. Now we're saying that there's traces of memory in the heart. So we're going to say there's traces of memory in the entire body. I think that's absolutely true. That's the direction that we're moving towards. That's issue number one. Issue number two with regards to Mozart. With regards to physical talents, this could be argued. I mean, there's a lot of literature that's been written about people like Mozart, whether they really have talent or it's really a lot of practice. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a few books about this. It's a whole conversation, whether this is really true. Let's assume that it's actually a real phenomenon, that there are kids that are born this way. The Zohar actually speaks about this. The Zohar talks about, on a spiritual level, the Zohar talks about a Yenuka. A Yenuka literally means an infant that still needs its mother's breast. He or she needs his mother's breast. A suckling. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's Yenuka. It talks about a spiritual Yenuka. A spiritual Yenuka is a child that from the moment that they're born, they actually retain memory of their entire past life. Let's say this child in a past life was a great musician. This child is born and knows music innately. Or we actually have this on another level. There was cases where serious scientific studies that were done with children from a very small age speak different dialects. That's correct. Ian Stevenson and 20 Cases of Just Reincarnation. There's a lot of books that are written on this topic where there are little kids that actually speak different dialects. These are phenomenons that are not usual. The reason why they're not usual because it's not the normal case of reincarnation. There's a possibility of reincarnation which we didn't talk about at all yet, which is when a full consciousness of a past person enters into a body with full memory. Why does it do this? There are basically two reasons. We're going to talk about the positive. It can mostly be for the negative. The positive is, it's possible that, let's imagine these 5 souls in a past life. Each one works on a tikkun. Let's say the soul of the thumb is the musician. They all worked on their tikkun, they articulated their positive, they overcame the negative completely. They did a good job. Now they come back into another form of life. Into another, and they reincarnate. 4 of them reincarnate. This soul already went through its process, doesn't have to come back down. 4 of them are working out, so there's 4 people. There's a mother, a father, and a brother and a sister. They're working on it. And they have to achieve a certain tikkun, and it's not working out. They're not getting it. They're not getting life's lesson. And everything in life is a lesson. They're not getting the lesson. It's possible for this soul of the thumb, which is perfect, full memory, will now reincarnate into another body and enter into this family. But it doesn't need a tikkun. It's perfect. There's no reason for the soul to be in this world. The only reason why the soul is in this world is actually to help these 4 other souls. When that occurs, this soul retains full memory of its past life, because it actually is the same consciousness of past life. It's like the story ended on page 120, and then there was a decision that says, you know what, we're going to add another 100 pages. So we're going to put the same blue book with the same story and move it into person number 2. And this person is continuing on page 121. So they're going to have all 120 pages already written. That's called a yenuka. That's a child from a very young age retains a spiritual quality from a past life, and it can also mean in terms of talents or memory, speaking another language, playing an instrument. It's possible for that crossover.
Is that person, is he aware?
He should be aware.
Reincarnated?
Yes, that's correct. Of course. They actually remember being in a past life. These people, these kids, I'm not saying Mozart, because Mozart, I said, is debatable, but these kids that speak other dialects at a very young age actually remember their past lives. They remember even how they were raised, and they remember their parents. They remember their past lives. That's correct. So that's an unusual phenomenon. There is a more prevalent or more phenomenon that actually occurs more often, which is a sad situation, but something that we can actually learn from, which is a soul that's already perfect may come down to this world into an imperfect body. Remember, this soul doesn't need a perfect body. It doesn't need anything. It doesn't need to be here. And the only reason why the soul comes down to the body is to actually help these other souls reach their tikkun. So what's the body it chooses? It's possible that the soul will enter into a fetus at birth or at conception, and this fetus will never become a healthy human being, and they may pass away at a very young age, and they may not think, maybe they're mentally retarded, or maybe they don't have full capacity, maybe they can't speak, maybe they're crippled, maybe God forbid they have like a terrible illness, and that's what they're born with. But this child, when you look at this child, you say, why is this child in this world? It can't speak. It can't. Now, of course, if there's a child could express, then we can say it's part of their own tikkun. But this child has nothing. It appears to the superficial eye that there's no reason why this child is here. It's just suffering. And the answer is that this child is really the most holy soul in the world, because this child is not here like any other person. 99% of people over here in the universe, the reason why they're here is for their own purpose. They're working on their own thing. This soul chooses to come down to this world, not for its own purpose, completely selfless, to help the souls that it is associated with. The parents, the siblings, whatever it is, to learn something, to grow, to help them, to do something, but not for its own purpose. And that's why there was a tradition, even with Down syndrome kids, when some great teachers, some great rabbis, when a Down syndrome kid would walk into the room, would stand up. And they would say, this is like the greatest teacher in the world. This is the soul of the greatest righteous person. You know, everyone else in life is still working on their perfection. This is a soul that's already perfect. And this is an important understanding to at least get a glimpse of what's going on. So sometimes you don't see anything deeper. We're just seeing the superficial. But on the deeper level, there's always something. There's always a reason, and there's a spiritual reason why these souls come down into this world.
They say autistic souls.
It could be autistic. Autistic is also an example of that. Let's take questions that people didn't ask yet. So in case someone else asks a question that didn't ask. Yeah. Nefesh? Very loosely, we can use these words interchangeably, but they're actually distinctions. And in English, they're arbitrary translations. So nefesh would be spirit, and neshama would be soul. But that's not really what we mean. Nefesh means, the best word we'll use for nefesh would be your ego. Survival. The part of self that makes you, that ensures that you survive. The part of self that when you're hungry, makes sure that you eat. When you're tired, make sure that you go to sleep. That's the preservation of the body. So an animal has a nefesh, right? Animals hunt when they're hungry, and a tree has a nefesh. And a tree bends to light when it's hungry, or to water. Everything has a level of nefesh. Ruach is already spirit. Ruach is wind. Spirit is already an emotional consciousness, which is to empathize. We'll do it better. Imagine a child. 3 developments in a child. A person works from nefesh, ruach, to neshama. When a person becomes bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah, we say that the person becomes mature. What actually happens? What's maturity? Well, that's a better question. What is maturity? Children are terribly selfish. Terribly. A little child, 6-month-old baby, only thinks about itself. Cries in the middle of the night to be fed. Doesn't care if it's 3 o'clock in the morning, the mother hasn't slept the whole night. Doesn't ask such questions. It just needs its own survival. Which is, it's healthy. God forbid a child wouldn't be this way, the child wouldn't survive. But the child has to cry when it's hungry, cry when it has something in need. And it always does. Thank God, it always cries. That's the nefesh level. That's the basic ingredient of survival. Sadly, there are people that are 100 years old that only still function on a level of nefesh. They're as selfish as a 2-year-old child. I mean, we know this. The toys has changed. Instead of holding onto their rubber ducky, they're holding onto their Cadillac, whatever. But it's the same idea. This is mine, and I don't want to give it up. This is the level of nefesh. Then there becomes an emotional maturity. That's when the child becomes 2, 3, 4. The child is becoming emotionally aware that there are other children. If you try to take a toy away from a 1-year-old, it's a losing battle. It's a losing battle. You can't take a toy from a 1-year-old, or else you distract them and steal the toy. But if you tell them, little Chaim, I need to take the toy and give it to your friend, no luck. The kid is not giving up his toy. But when the kid becomes a little bit more mature, let's say 2, 3 years old, you can explain to him, that just like you want the toy, he also wants the toy. So maybe we can share. Maybe we can do an exchange. You get his toy, she gets your toy, right? That's all of a sudden the person is evolving to the level of ruach, which is emotional intelligence, an awareness of an other on an emotional level. So first you have nefesh, which is selfish, then you have a little bit ruach, which is more selfless. Then a person becomes mature, that's neshama. Neshama means intellectually mature. What does intellectually mature mean? It's not only do you feel another person, but you can actually understand why they feel that way. I know when I'm 2 years old that you want to share the toy. And I feel for you, so therefore I feel that you're sad, so I want to give you the toy. But I can't really make you happy, the only thing I can do is give you the toy. But when you see someone, and you're a mature person, and you see someone sad, it's not only you just responding to their sadness, but you can actually know what's bothering them. And you can fix it. Because you can enter into the other person's space. You can think about what is really bothering them. I know this is the way they're expressing that they're hurt, but what's really going on? You see someone sad, maybe they're mourning, maybe they're, so you understand that. That's already a fuller level of maturity. That's called neshama. So in life, we actually work from nefesh, which is selfish, to ruach, which is more selfless, to neshama, which is more selfless. And then we reach higher levels, which is chaya and yechida. These are very high levels of soul, where a person becomes really transparent of ego and completely selfless. That's correct. That's correct. So nefesh we share with everything else. Ruach we share with animals. Neshama is what the human being's quality.
What is the difference
The different coloring. I don't. It's a complicated conversation. But I would just listen. If there were non-Jews in the room, I would have to answer the question more seriously. If everyone's Jewish in the room, I could just say that since we're the Jewish souls, we're talking about the Jewish soul. This is the way it works. It has to, in a basic definition, it has to do with the connection into the great soul of Adam. Different soul roots are rooted in different areas. There is definitely a Jewish soul, just like there's an Irish soul. There are different souls, different consciousness of people that are rooted within the great soul of Adam, and that reflects itself also in their physical selves and their emotional and spiritual selves. But there's definitely distinctions of souls because there are different people. Different people have different expressions.
So when there's intermarriage, then what happens?
There's really no such concept of intermarriage. No, there is no concept of intermarriage because the child that will be born from an intermarriage is either 100% Jewish or 100% not Jewish, halachically. So you can't really create a mixture of souls. I don't want to open this conversation because it's a very complicated conversation. There's actually souls, just like, this is all the regular root of reincarnation. There's possible a lot of variants of this concept. It's possible for male souls, let's say for example, generally tend to reincarnate into males. And female souls generally tend to reincarnate into females. But there are crossovers. There are male souls in female bodies, female souls in male bodies. And just like there's Jewish souls in non-Jewish bodies and non-Jewish souls in Jewish bodies. So there are crossovers. Let's say, for example, a convert who's born a non-Jew and then goes through a conversion. What does that mean? It means that originally this soul comes from the same root of the great soul of Adam. It journeyed elsewhere, and now it's coming back home. So there's that idea. It's not only what we see. Sometimes we have to look a little bit deeper and see the way things eventually articulate themselves and how they develop.
So all converts are originally
Jewish souls, old converts, and that's what they're feeling that they don't belong in their body. I'm talking about everything's talking about genuine. I'm talking about a person really made a serious commitment to adapt a new way of life. This is because they really feel this pull from birth. I mean, you speak to a lot of converts, and they'll tell you that even as little children, they felt always a strong connection to the Jews. This is because really they belong there. There's something very interesting in terms of like this historical narrative. Remember we talked a little bit before about the odd kid out. Everyone's doctors and one kid's, and this is like a soul that comes from other parts within the soul of Adam to create balance. There's something very interesting that this generation, and this is a precedence for that because this also happened after the expulsion of Spain a little bit. There's some very famous prominent converts, and also after the destruction of the Second Temple. But after great Jewish trauma, there's always a lot of converts that come in the next generation. So the great trauma of Jewish trauma is the Holocaust. And the next generation produces a lot of converts. And the way I think it works is like this. That trauma is carried in the genes. If you're born to Holocaust survivors or family that are Holocaust survivors, even though you didn't personally go through it, trauma is carried through in genes. Those gene markers are turned on and it's carried through. Over time, when there's very high levels of trauma, this we're just talking about our story. Of course, it works with every group of people, but we're talking about the Jewish narrative. Whenever we go through collectively a big trauma, there's high markers of trauma that are turned on. This can be very suffocating to a people. I think by divine design, what happens now is souls reincarnate into non-Jewish bodies. Physically and on a genetic level, they don't carry that trauma. When they reintegrate into the Jewish community, what they're doing is creating a balance or an equilibrium. They're balancing out the energy that from the non-trauma and the trauma so it can balance into a healthy place. That's why serious non-converts are very happy to become Jewish. A lot of Jews are not too happy about being Jewish. So this actually balances that energy. So after trauma, conversions, because what you're getting is you're getting an influx of genes that were not affected on a traumatic level, on a physical level, but spiritually they can contribute, and that creates balance. And I think this works on, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. The moment of conception. I want to tell you something very interesting. Your wife is like looking at you, I'm not sure, but but I want to say something else, that according to the Zohar, every time a person is intimate with their spouse, or for that matter, any type of intimacy, you're creating souls. We're always creating energy. Hopefully it's positive energy, and God forbid if it's in a situation where it's not consensual and not loving, it's negative energy. And these are creation of souls. So this is a very big conversation in the Zohar, where intimacy is supposed to be seen as the holiest thing in the world, because you're bringing down souls into this world. So we're always bringing down souls into this world. When there's a conception, that means that the soul becomes now a soul of a particular person. And that soul becomes attached. If it's not, we're actually creating souls for future generations, or for people that need more strength to have children, or to bring positive, loving energy. They're with you. Where are they? There's nowhere to go. They're always with us. It's the energy. So that's the energy the energy field that surrounds you. If you're feeling, we have an energy field, and this is called a gufdak, ethereal body, where there's a projection of our body that surrounds us.
Is it one when somebody dies and I heard something about all the different souls are left there?
That's correct.
Created something. Could you explain that, because I heard it, but it's not.
Just like we have physical form, the body that you're looking at, there's a parallel to this physical form which is metaphysical. Which means that every time we have a thought, we're creating energy. Every time we say a word, we're creating energy. We do an action, we're creating energy. This energy field is a reflection of our physical form. And actually, when a person passes on, they enter from their coarse body, they actually enter into their ethereal body. If you're familiar a little bit with like near-death experience literature, everyone speaks about entering into a cloud, or to a light form, or to feeling your body very light. This is the Kabbalistic understanding of this, which is actually mentioned in the Talmud. It's not even a Kabbalistic idea. The Talmud mentions that after a great sage, Rabbi Yehuda, passed away, the next week he showed up in his house. Now, it doesn't mean that he crawled out of the grave. He was still in the grave. He was under the ground. But somehow, he appeared in his house, in form. And then he was able to make Kiddush for his family. This goes on for a little while, and the word got out that he's coming every Friday night, and he said, you know what, I'm going to stop doing it, because then they can say, you know, other sages are not we're not as great as I am that can do this. What this means is that just like we have physical form, and the physical form, like we spoke earlier, is a manifestation of our spiritual quality, the physical form of the body is the signature that's a reflection of our spiritual signature, our spiritual self. The same thing also works outwardly, that every time we have a thought, we have a feeling, we say something, we do something, we're creating this energy field. This energy field is an exact replica of who we are. It doesn't have the properties of the four elements of fire, wind, earth, and water. It only has the properties of wind and fire. Wind and fire without water and earth is untangible, but it's observable. You can't touch it, but you can observe it. This is a form, and this is what we talk about, the body that exists after death. We're not actually talking about the physical body. The physical body, after it passes on, lays in the ground, and eventually just becomes mineral and becomes someone else's body.
How long can you connect with relatives?
Usually up to 40 years. I don't want to get into this whole process, but generally souls remain aware of what's going on in this world through a small part of the body that actually remains in this world, that doesn't disintegrate. It's called a luzbon. There's a part of the body that doesn't disintegrate. Through that, their guf dak, their ethereal body, can not only become aware, but can actually be projected into this physical form. Can be projected into physical matter. You can observe them.